Homer's Iliad. It's the greatest epic poem ever written. A tale of the legendary heroes and battles of the Trojan War, when the Greeks fought to win back Helen of Troy.
What you have there is this wonderful cast of characters, this myth.
But for one man, the Iliad's tales were more than just myth.
Homer must be literally true, and it was going to be his life's mission to prove it.
For Heinrich Schlieman, the poem was a treasure map which could trace a path to untold riches. Priceless jewels presented to Helen of Troy by King Priam.
It was gold, and it was immensely valuable.
Schlieman would pursue this obsession for over 20 years.
He had this incredible self-confidence.
He had one idea in mind, which was to find the treasure.
And his story would become an epic in its own right. The tale of one man's hunt for the lost jewels of Helen of Troy. In 1866, the man who would devote his life to finding Homer's Troy arrived in London. Heinrich Schlieman was a rich German businessman with an appetite for travel and an insatiable curiosity. Schlieman found London poised at the edge of an intellectual revolution. Charles Darwin had rewritten human origins, and his findings had stirred a new wave of curiosity.
It was certainly true that the timing for Schlieman was perfect. There was a huge interest in prehistory spreading around the archaeological world.
Until now, European civilization was thought to have begun with ancient Greece. But there was a growing sense that its origins might have been far earlier, that an ancient human past was just waiting to be found.
In Schlieman's day, people had very little idea that there was much prehistory before classical Greece.
To Schlieman, finding the first great European civilization seemed a worthy quest for a rich man wanting to establish his reputation. And despite his lack of expertise, he planned to invest his large fortune in the booming science of archaeology.
It was probably the most exciting thing you could think of doing when he turned to archaeology.
But I don't think Schlieman was going out to find prehistory. His motives weren't so intellectual. He was a successful businessman, retired early, was looking for something interesting to do.
Schlieman was seduced by archaeology's potential to unite his two great passions, making money and the legendary story of Troy.
Whoever could find it was sort of ensured a great and glorious future.
Schlieman claimed to have been obsessed by Troy since boyhood, when he first read the Iliad. Written by the ancient Greek author Homer, the Iliad tells the tale of a great king named Priam, who ruled over the city of Troy at around 1250 BC.
The story of Troy, in a way, had everything for archaeologists, because it had this very rich myth, and it had these characters.
King Priam's son, Paris, caused chaos by seducing the beautiful Greek princess Helen, stealing her away from her husband Menelaus and back to his father's city.
Helen was reputed to be the most beautiful woman in the world.
In response, Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, the most powerful of all the Greek states, launched 1,000 ships to win Helen back and camped a huge army near the city walls.
The Greeks, in a coalition under Agamemnon, get together to take back Helen by force.
What makes it so fascinating is the scale of it all.
After a dramatic 10-year siege, the Greeks broke through, killing Troy's remaining inhabitants and burning the city to the ground.
So there you have it all. You have these heroes, you have battles, you have wealth, and you have beautiful women.
For Schlieman, the most thrilling detail of all was the promise of buried riches. In the Iliad, Homer wrote of Priam's treasure, a priceless collection of gold and jewels that the king had bestowed upon Helen. Schlieman was transfixed by the idea that this gold had been hidden away in the dying city during Troy's final destruction by fire.
This was the image he carried with him.
He was so obsessed by the Iliad that he took the story of Priam's treasure as literal fact.
Homer had said there was gold, so there was gold.
Treasure does not, in fact, play that big a part in the Iliad. It played an enormous part in Schlieman's mentality.
Schlieman believed the Iliad was full of clues for archaeologists to discover, and that by following them, he would be led to Priam's treasure. Most 19th century historians disagreed. They thought Homer's Troy was just a myth, not a real historical event.
A lot of scholars thought that there was no such place except in Homer's imagination, that it was mythological.
But Schlieman's belief was unshakable, and he set himself the task of unraveling the Iliad's clues with the same dedication that had made his fortune in business.
Well, he had phenomenal energy.
He was a man of huge resolution and focus. And once he decided to learn something, he set about it as with a military campaign. But he could get by in 22 languages.
Schlieman taught himself ancient Greek in just a few months. He spoke nothing else and filled notebooks with translations until he could read Homer fluently in the original. The businessman was busy transforming himself into a self-styled archaeologist.
He set about acquiring a knowledge of ancient literature and ancient history. And he was a very capable man, a very intelligent man.
In late 1868, with Homer in his pocket, Schlieman set sail in search of Troy.
He had one idea in mind, which was to find the treasure.
His destination was the Troad, a plain on the northwestern coast of Turkey. Although Schlieman was not the first to seek Troy there, he was convinced that with Homer's help, he could succeed where others failed.
Since the 19th century, people have gone to look for Troy in the northwestern corner of what is now Turkey. But that's a very big area.
Searching the Troad was never going to be easy. The area covered almost 100 square miles. And Homer's Troy was 1,000 years older than ancient Rome. It would inevitably be submerged below ground, or hidden beneath buildings that came afterwards.
Prehistory was not thought to have any proper sites because they were all buried under layers and layers of later settlements.
Schlieman was hopeful that a hilltop village named Burnabashi might hold the answer. Burnabashi was surrounded by archaeological remains and seemed the perfect match for Homer's Troy.
Burnabashi had some of the attributes that people were looking for, including clearly prehistoric traces of fortification.
It was in a commanding position. It had remains on the top. It had burial mounds. It had rivers at the bottom. It all fitted the description of Homer's Troy very well.
Archaeologists had already excavated the area in search of Troy, but had found nothing. Schlieman wasn't fazed. He had his own unique way to test whether Burnabashi fitted the Iliad's bill. In a renowned episode of the Iliad, the Greek hero Achilles chases the Trojan warrior Hector around the walls of Troy 3 times, before finally slaying him in single combat. Schlieman's idea was simply to take Homer at his word by acting out this famous scene. If Schlieman himself could run around the hill 3 times, then Burnabashi could be Troy. But Schlieman saw a problem straight away. He realized that no one could physically tackle the course Homer had described here, not even the demigod Achilles. He ended up practically crawling on all 4s.
The trouble was it was on a very steep hill slope, and anybody who is taking the Iliad literally, as Schlieman was, could clearly see that that wouldn't do.
Schlieman's mind was made up. Homer was always right, so Burnabashi couldn't be Troy.
He concluded that Troy wasn't there, but must be somewhere else.
Schlieman needed a new way forward. And his faith in Homer and the Iliad was about to pay off.
It is an incredibly valuable attribute to have, to be simply lucky, and I think that Schlieman was.
Schlieman's next stop was a hill called Hisarlik, 8 kilometers northwest of Burnabashi. Standing in the shadow of Mount Ida, Hisarlik was no stranger to suspicion. It was first alleged to be Troy's location as far back as the 15th century. But no one had ever found evidence.
Experience the past like never before with History Hit's award-winning original documentaries and ad-free podcasts with our expert historians like Dan Snow, Susanna Lipscomb, Lucy Worsley, Mary Beard, Tristan Hughes, and myself, Matt Lewis. Sign up for an exclusive discount using the link in the description and embark on your historical journey from the wonders of ancient Egypt and the life of Anne Boleyn to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte and the discovery of Shackleton's endurance. Get history wherever, whenever, exclusively on History Hit.
When Schlieman arrived, he found the site already occupied by a British archaeologist named Frank Calvert. Calvert too had dreams of finding Troy and had purchased half of Hisarlik's land in order to conduct his own excavations.
The problem for Frank Calvert was he just didn't have the money to do anything on a large scale. So when Schlieman came along, I think he saw an opportunity. Here was a man with a lot of money, and he could get him interested in the site.
Excited by the prospect of a more extensive dig, Calvert let Schlieman into the secret of Hisarlik. What looked like a hill was in fact a man-made mound of earth.
What his excavations showed him was that there were not only Greek and Roman ruins on the top, which was quite obvious from the surface, but that underneath these ruins there were deeper layers of earlier periods.
No one, not even Calvert, knew for certain just how old the hill was. But he thought the site might date all the way back to 1250 BC, the time of the Iliad and Helen of Troy.
He believed there was a real possibility that underneath these ruins was the Troy talked about by Homer.
Schlieman put the mound to his Achilles test. Unlike Burnabashi, it passed with flying colors. Hisarlik fitted Schlieman's mental image of Troy in every way. There was a ruined temple, rivers on the plain below, and a mountain range in the distance. The whole landscape was straight from the pages of the Iliad. Schlieman was ready to dig for Troy, and he wanted to get started straight away. But Calvert said he'd need permission from the Turkish government.
Calvert was a cautious man, the exact opposite of Schlieman.
But Schlieman hadn't made his fortune being cautious. Ignoring Calvert, he employed workers to begin the dig regardless. Permission could wait.
He was a man of influence. He had a lot of money. What he didn't have was diplomacy, which is a useful asset if you're going to dig in a foreign country.
The Turks were outraged when they learned Schliemann was already digging. They demanded he left Hisarlik. But Schliemann wasn't about to give up.
He established many connections with the powerful and highly regarded.
He was firing off letters left, right, and centre.
Schliemann bombarded the Turks with a mixture of apologies and threats.
Schliemann's letters reveal a bullying attitude towards the weak and a very grovelling, sycophantic attitude towards the strong.
He knew how to pull strings. He knew which strings to pull. He knew where maybe to grease a palm. And I think that helped him to persuade the Turkish authorities to let him do what he wanted.
After 3 years, Schliemann struck a deal. He would have to pay for all excavations at Hisarlik, and then split any findings 50-50 with the Turkish government. But at last he had his official go-ahead to dig for Troy. So he set to work. But Schliemann soon learned that Hisarlik was a highly complex site. There were many different eras of human history buried in the mound.
The way the mound had built up over time was that one layer had formed on top of another, one after another, like a series of upside-down pudding basins.
Over the centuries, successive inhabitants of Hisarlik had added new layers, each one built up over hundreds of years. Schliemann naturally assumed that if Homer's Troy dated from 1250 BC, 3,000 years ago, then it had to be at the bottom.
In Schliemann's mind, the fact that Homer is at the beginning of Greek literature meant that Homer's Troy must be at the beginning of the succession of Troys.
Schliemann developed a plan that was simple and brutal. He would cut a massive trench, bulldozing right through the middle of the mound.
To do that was an incredibly drastic measure, even by the lights of the 1870s.
Schliemann wasn't like that. He just wanted to sort of cut straight through, find the treasure, build up the picture of Troy, and be the man who discovered Troy.
Frank Calvert was horrified. As a professional archaeologist, he urged Schliemann to take a less reckless approach, peeling away thin layers of soil and sifting evidence carefully.
We can see from his own excavations how Frank Calvert went about things. He would have wanted Schliemann to excavate sort of gently and slowly.
But Schliemann could practically smell Priam's treasure. He wanted to press on, full steam ahead.
Schliemann vitally ignored the advice that Calvert gave him, that this was going to be a complicated site and should be treated with caution. The reaction to this is the beginning of the falling out between Calvert and Schliemann.
Schliemann brought in huge resources of equipment and men. His fortune meant that he could buy all the machinery of open-cast mining.
His object was to pull down great chunks of earth to get down to the bottom as quickly as possible.
There were winches, levers, even battering rams, and perhaps most shockingly of all, dynamite.
Well, his methods do read slightly alarmingly.
He was a thoughtless and clumsy archaeologist. He did not respect sites. He did not pinpoint things properly.
It did mean that a lot of detail was lost to him if he was moving such large amounts of spoil.
Schliemann was often joined on site by his wife Sophia, a young Greek woman, 30 years his junior. Sophia reminded Schlieman of Helen of Troy, and he was desperate to involve her in the quest for Priam's treasure. But so far, his finds were disappointing.
He kept on having in mind that somewhere in this mound there was going to be gold.
Instead of gold, Schlieman was finding only pottery, and it seemed strangely primitive. It was nothing like the splendor of Homer's Troy that he'd imagined.
He wasn't terribly interested in finding shards and little bits of pottery, particularly as they didn't sort of seem to belong to what his idea of Troy was.
His dream of Troy seemed to be fading. This was a treasure hunt with no treasure. The 1871 dig drew a blank. But Schlieman wasn't yet ready to give up.
It was just a question of going deep enough and digging enough, and the gold would be there.
In 1872, Schlieman returned for a second season. And at last, he got some real encouragement and some genuine treasure. His workers unearthed a huge marble frieze. It showed the god Apollo in his chariot, driving 4 horses. Schlieman realized it came from a Greek temple that occupied the mound in around 300 BC. So it was 1,000 years too late to be from Homer's Troy. But he had, at least, found something.
It was a very significant piece, and it must have had quite a high value.
But there was a big problem with the find. Schlieman had found the marble on Frank Calvert's land, and his deal with Calvert was that they'd split the proceeds.
The deal was, between him and Frank Calvert, that fines were to be halved. Well, you couldn't halve a thing like this. One or other of them had to have it.
Schlieman haggled with Calvert as if they were rivals rather than partners.
He was ruthless with people. If things didn't go his way, he could be hard and difficult.
Schlieman offered to buy his share of the marble at what he claimed was its market price. Of course, the real value was much higher.
It shouldn't have been a surprise to Calvert that Schlieman was a cutthroat businessman, but I think he was shocked by this all the same.
It was the last straw for Calvert. He walked off the excavation. For many, losing their archaeological mentor would have been a major setback. But it didn't deter Schlieman. Though inexperienced, he carried on and started to use what Calvert had taught him.
As time went on, he did improve. He did have this training in bookkeeping, and this must have ingrained in him a habit of accurate recording.
Schlieman began to note the precise position of each find and variations in the soil from layer to layer. He brought photographers in to record every detail.
Schlieman introduced photography, eventually beautiful photography. I think they surpass anything done on the site since.
Schlieman was gradually building up a detailed picture of the mound. And by the third dig season in 1873, Schlieman's efforts paid off. Deep in the mound, he uncovered signs of what looked like a prehistoric city. There was a paved ramp, a magnificent tower, and an imposing gate. For Schlieman, it was everything that Homer had described as Troy. He was convinced he'd found the gateway to the palace of the great King Priam.
And there was a gate, and there was behind it a building which he thought might be Priam's palace. So he was definitely of the view that this fitted with Homer.
By the close of that season, Schlieman had uncovered another vital clue.
He had found what he thought was very important, which was that the period he was investigating had been heavily burnt.
This charring and ash was on the layer Schlieman called Troy II, just above the bottom of the mound. Here, it seemed, was the proof he had been searching for. For Schlieman, these were clear signs of Troy's infamous destruction by fire, once the Greeks had laid siege to the city. Schlieman was convinced this layer was Homer's Troy, and trumpeted his discovery to the world. But when the news reached his hometown of Berlin, Schlieman was stunned to find himself the object of ridicule.
The attacks on Schlieman were astonishingly strong and hard.
His whole manner of publicizing them just invited academic scorn.
He was caricatured in the press as a gold digger with a trophy wife. His methods were mercilessly lampooned.
The Berlin intelligentsia thought he was vulgar and provincial.
This mania for gold meant that he was a treasure seeker. He was not a serious inquirer after the truth. And Schlieman found this very hard.
Worst of all, his key findings about Priam's palace and Homer's Troy were dismissed. His methods lacked precision, and his one find lacked a date. Schlieman accused his enemies of libel and lies. But privately, even he was racked with doubts. In Schlieman's mind, there were two particularly serious problems with the site of Troy II.
He did by 1873 realize that the site was really too small by comparison with what you'd expect from Homer.
According to Homer, Troy was a well-peopled city of approximately 100,000 inhabitants at the time of the Trojan War. But the site Schlieman had found was only the length of a football pitch along the side. If Troy II was really Homer's magnificent city, it should be bigger.
This is too small, obviously, for the great city that Homer talks about.
And then there was the second problem. Homer spoke of Troy as a city rich in gold, but all Schlieman had found was primitive pottery. With just 2 weeks remaining in the dig season, Schlieman knew he had to do something to salvage his reputation. He had to find hard evidence of Homer's Troy.
Everybody was very skeptical about what he was doing. And he found any form of criticism extremely hard to bear.
And then, just before the season ended, something happened. Schlieman claimed that as the excavations continued, he suddenly spotted something in a wall of Troy II. He used a pretext to send the workers for an early break, leaving Schlieman and Sophia alone on site. She was, he said, the only witness to the discovery of a lifetime.
There it is. There is this astonishing cache of brightly shining gold. And it's everything he always dreamt it might be.
There were bracelets and necklaces, gold rings, goblets, and so much more.
It was gold and silver vessels and a lot of bronze objects, all apparently packed up into one tight little collection.
It was gold, and it was immensely valuable. So on every score at that one moment, he must have thought, I've done it. I've done what I really wanted to do.
For Schlieman, there was only one way the gold could have got there. It was Priam's treasure, abandoned in the wall as the Trojans fled the burning city.
He had in his hands the proof of everything that he had maintained and the people had not believed.
And this all helped to prove that this really was Troy and that the Trojan War had happened.
Schlieman called his find the Jewels of Helen. As a final flourish, Schlieman claimed that Sophia carried some of the treasure home in her red shawl.
You can sense this unbelievable excitement about what was going on.
Once again, Schlieman shouted his discovery to the world. But this time, he chose an ingenious way to go about it. He summoned his photographer, and in the process, created one of the most famous archaeological photographs ever seen.
He got Sophia to dress up and wear this jewelry and be photographed in it.
The photograph went worldwide. It was a brilliant piece of public relations. Schlieman was now famous.
That, in a sense, was almost his finest hour to say to all his opponents, look, I got the jewelry, and what's more, here it is on my wife.
But back in Berlin, Schlieman's critics were enraged. For them, the photograph was proof once more that Schlieman was a treasure seeker, not a serious archaeologist.
The photograph must have been almost most calculated to drive his opponents completely mad.
The establishment ramped up their attack. And Schlieman's version of events gave his enemies the perfect ammunition. He was caught out by two unfortunate facts.
He said that his wife, Sophie, was there at the time and helped him dig it out. It's totally untrue. She'd left earlier in the season to go home to Athens.
Despite Schlieman's account, it seemed that he had invented a witness to a discovery that had never happened. Schlieman's response was that he simply wanted to involve Sophia in his life's work.
Sophie didn't like archaeology at all, and she hated being on site, and Schlieman wanted her to be involved. He would do such a crass thing.
Secondly, Schlieman was shifty about where exactly he had found the treasure in Troy too.
Sometimes he says he found it outside the citadel wall of Troy too. Sometimes he says he found it on the citadel wall of Troy too, and this is supposed to be an indication that the whole treasure was, or part of it, was made up.
The allegations implied that Schlieman had the treasure faked by a jeweler, and even today, most experts agree that his accounts can't be trusted.
The discovery of the treasure of Priam had been embroidered, manipulated, and was in part totally false.
But despite all of the accusations, the public wanted to believe Schlieman, and crucially, the jewels themselves seemed to back him up. Schlieman had all his finds photographed or drawn by artists for publication. And when experts studied it, the treasure matched closely in style, as it would if it was all from the same find. For all of the allegations, Helen's jewels seemed to be what Schlieman said they were.
I think Priam's treasure was substantially or wholly genuine, and Schlieman found it more or less as he says. There may be a little bit of confusion over some of the objects.
Soon critics were the least of Schlieman's problems. The government wanted their half of the spoils, and to keep the treasure in Turkey.
There was an outcry from the Turks, who quite rightly said that the treasure was theirs.
But in Schlieman's mind, he had found it, so he owned it.
Schlieman certainly believed that everything he found was his.
He hastily packed the treasure up and smuggled it to Greece, where it is said Sophia's family hid it in the Athenian countryside. His prize was safe. Overseas, and successfully out of the government's clutches. But although Schlieman had kept his gold, now he needed more.
The trouble for Schlieman was that finding the gold was not enough.
To Schlieman, it was now about more than treasure. He had critics to silence and truths he was desperate to prove.
He really wanted to be a scholar, and he wanted to be accepted. He was almost pathetically grateful to be accepted by scholars as a scholar.
Schlieman needed to prove he really had found Priam's treasure by confirming it was made in 1250 BC, the time of the Iliad.
There clearly remained this question about whether he had really found Troy or not.
But in the early days of archaeology, dating finds wasn't simple. The only reliable method was to compare the pottery Schlieman had found near Helen's jewels to a sample from the correct era. So Schlieman resolved to dig at the one place he was certain he could accurately date: Mycenae. Mycenae was the palace of King Priam's great nemesis, the Greek king Agamemnon. So it should have dated from the Iliad's era. And crucially, structures from that period had already been excavated there. If Schlieman could find pottery in Mycenae, he could use it to put a date on Homer's Troy and silence his critics.
I think that Schlieman was so determined to prove that what he'd found was right. It was a sort of desperation in a way.
With his reputation at stake, Schlieman set about his dig in Greece. Once again, he decided to excavate according to the clues in his favorite type of guide, the writings of an ancient author. The Greek writer Pausanias had said that 5 graves of King Agamemnon and his closest companions could be found at Mycenae. Experts thought Pausanias was highly unreliable, but Schlieman followed his descriptions like a guidebook.
What he read in Pausanias was that Agamemnon had been buried within the wall. So Schlieman, ignoring the very fine-built tombs outside the walls, went and dug within the wall.
Within days, he had found something. Tombstones marking out a circle of graves, each lined with treasure, exactly as Pausanias predicted.
Schlieman was led by this reading of a very questionable source to dig in a place that proved quite literally a gold mine.
And one particular find was greater than all of the others. It was a funeral mask, found on the face of a 35-year-old warrior. A famous story says Schlieman cabled the king of Greece with the words, "I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon." Schlieman's literal-minded approach shouldn't have worked, but it had.
The same thing happened as had happened at Troy, that through a series of blunders, he stumbled upon a discovery of tremendous fame and appeal.
But chiefly, for Schlieman, above all of these new riches, he had found sufficient proof to authenticate Troy. The layout of the palace and the style of the pottery told him what a power center of the 13th century BC would actually look like.
He found there what the buildings looked like, what the pottery looked like, what the small finds looked like.
With his newfound archaeological confidence, Schlieman believed that if he could return to Hisarlik just one last time, he could finally prove that he had found Homer's Troy.
Bit by bit, he was beginning to assemble proof for what he was trying to establish, which was the legend of Troy and the siege of Troy.
By 1890, Schlieman had repaired his relations with the Turkish government, and he was granted permission to tackle Troy one last time. His plan, to use Mycenae's pottery and buildings to confirm once and for all that the mound at Hisarlik dated to 1250 BC, and that he really had found the treasure of King Priam. By now, Schlieman had recruited brilliant technical help in the form of the ingenious architect Wilhelm Dörpfeld.
He had a very good understanding of architecture and how to record it, and he had a very good understanding of how to put on paper the complexities of the site.
Under Dörpfeld's influence, Schlieman was persuaded to turn his attention from Troy 2 to a layer called Troy 6, almost 40 feet nearer the surface. At just 6.5 feet below ground, Schlieman had previously ignored this level, passing straight through it in his search for Troy 2. Dörpfeld suggested that they try digging for Troy 6 further afield, away from Schlieman's previous excavations at the center of the mound. Sure enough, their broader excavation soon produced results. Troy 6 was a much bigger city, with buildings and pottery matching those that Schlieman had found at Mycenae. Finally, Schlieman believed he'd found the object of his obsession, Homer's Troy. But with triumph came devastating realizations. If Troy 6 was Homer's Troy, then Troy 2, where Schlieman had found Priam's treasure, couldn't be.
I think it must be shattering for anybody to have their own discoveries and their own theses so conclusively disproved without really any scope for argument.
And worse still, in his rush to reach the bottom of the mound, Schlieman had blasted right through the very city he had spent 20 years searching for. In the process, he had destroyed vast amounts of the real Troy and ruined vital archaeological evidence.
He must have had to face up to the fact that he had destroyed a great deal of evidence by the way that he had dug earlier.
When the truth dawned on him, Schlieman was overcome by shock.
Schlieman went off into his tent and didn't come out for 3 days. And then eventually when he did come out, he quietly said, "I think you're right."
It was the first and only time that Schlieman ever admitted his mistake.
That one story of him talking to Dörpfeld is, in a sense, his acknowledgement of what he'd done.
In 1890, Schlieman went to his grave, publicly maintaining his belief in Troy 2 and the amazing jewels of Helen of Troy, avoiding confrontation of the awful truth. But the mystery of Priam's treasure was far from over. Schlieman bequeathed Helen's jewels to the Museum of Berlin, and there they lay safe until the 20th century, when they disappeared, becoming the lost jewels all over again.
It was rather parallel to the whole story of the Troy treasure, which had always been a mystery.
In April 1945, Berlin, like Troy, faced total destruction at the hands of enemy invaders. The Nazi Third Reich entered its final death throes in the Battle of Berlin as the Soviet Union's Red Army surrounded the city. But when Hitler was dead and the war was over, the treasure had vanished.
Nobody knew where it was. It seemed to have disappeared.
The Russians denied taking it, leaving Helen of Troy's treasure missing once more. Then suddenly, after almost 50 years, Heinrich Schlieman and his finds hit the headlines yet again.
One of the world's most famous archaeological finds, the Trojan gold, goes on show in Moscow tomorrow.
In 1994, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russians finally admitted to possession of the treasure.
They felt they were entitled to it as war reparations for all the huge damage done by the Germans in Russia.
The treasure was in Moscow and was put on display at the Pushkin Museum. Donald Easton was one of the few Western archaeologists invited to view the collection.
There was absolutely no doubt that these were the objects which had been in Berlin.
Easton became convinced that the treasure had not been faked by Schlieman himself. It had clearly been in a Trojan soil for centuries.
What was also clear was that these were objects which had come out of the ground. There was no question of their having been manufactured to order in the 19th century.
But with this recognition came a twist. Easton confirmed what Schlieman probably knew, but could never admit.
What we call Priam's treasure wasn't actually Priam's treasure. It was 1,000 years earlier than any Trojan War which may have taken place.
Troy, too, where Schlieman had found the treasure, had been built in around 2300 BC, 1,000 years earlier than Homer's Troy. So Schlieman's find could not have been Helen of Troy's jewels. But what he had found was evidence of one of the first European civilizations, earlier than anything unearthed before. Today, Schlieman lies in a spectacular mausoleum in Athens. On its walls, scenes from the Iliad meet stories from Schlieman's own excavations, forever uniting their two tales. For many, Schlieman doesn't deserve it.
Some people were very dismissive. They thought he was a charlatan.
Is one of the most intensely dislikable and certainly disliked figures in the whole history of the 19th century.
Yet despite his detractors, Schlieman's legacy is ultimately one of archaeological success. He had discovered an entire period of human history even older than Troy, known as the Early Bronze Age.
It was, and still is, a very important thing in its own right. It's a very important piece of documentation for what society was like in the early Bronze Age, and it was found by Schlieman.
He found something very wonderful, and it makes him an extraordinary character.
To most, such a find would have been glory enough. But for Schlieman, there had only ever been one prize. And although his discovery remains one of the world's greatest treasures, it wasn't Helen's jewels. But then Schlieman himself would never have admitted that.